Some dogs bark because they hear something. Ranger barked because he remembered something nobody else could see. The rain began just after sunset, drifting across the hills outside Pine Hollow, Montana, in long silver curtains. The narrow roads glistened beneath the fading light, and the scent of wet earth rose from the forest floor like an old memory waking from sleep. Most people hurried home before the storm grew stronger. Porch lights flickered on. Curtains closed. The town settled into its usual evening quiet. But nearly 2 miles beyond the last farmhouse, deep along an abandoned logging trail, a German shepherd stood alone beneath an ancient oak tree. Ranger was 5 years old, broad-shouldered and alert, with a thick sable coat darkened by rain. Water dripped from his ears and rolled down his muzzle, yet he refused to move. His amber eyes remained fixed on a strange bulge protruding from the side of the massive tree. The growth looked almost natural at first glance. Just another scar formed by decades of storms and seasons. But Ranger disagreed. He barked once. Loud, sharp, determined. The sound echoed through the forest and vanished into the gathering darkness. Then he barked again, and again. Half a mile away, Staff Sergeant Jack Turner loaded groceries into the back of his truck when he heard the distant sound. He paused. The rain tapped against his jacket while he listened carefully. Most people would not have recognized it. But Jack had spent years working beside military dogs overseas. He knew the difference between an ordinary bark and a warning. This was not excitement. This was not fear. Ranger was trying to tell someone something. Jack climbed into the truck and drove toward the forest. The headlights cut through the rain while the windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. 20 minutes later, he parked beside the old logging trail and stepped into the storm. The scent of pine and wet bark filled the air. Somewhere ahead, Ranger barked again. Jack followed the sound through the trees. Branches swayed overhead. Wind whispered through the leaves. Then he saw him. Ranger stood at the base of the enormous oak, completely soaked, staring at the strange lump growing from its trunk. The dog did not run to greet him. He did not wag his tail. He simply barked once more and looked back toward the tree. Jack frowned. "What is it, buddy?" Ranger immediately stepped closer to the oak. His nose pressed against the rough bark. He sniffed intensely before releasing another bark. Jack walked around the tree. The oak was enormous, at least 4 feet across at its widest point. Its roots twisted through the earth like giant wooden ropes. The bulge itself protruded nearly 18 inches from the trunk, large enough to catch anyone's attention. Yet it appeared harmless, natural, ordinary. Jack crouched beside it and ran his fingers across the damp bark. Nothing. No scent. No movement. No visible reason for concern. Ranger barked again, more urgently this time. The German shepherd pawed gently at the ground before returning to the bulge. Jack studied his partner carefully. Something felt wrong. Over the years, Ranger had proven himself remarkably reliable. He was not the type of dog to become obsessed without reason. If he focused on something, there was usually a cause. "You have never done this before," Jack said quietly. Ranger's ears lifted. The dog stared directly at the strange growth on the tree. Then he sat down beside it and refused to move. Rain continued falling around them. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Still Ranger remained there, watching, waiting. The forest grew darker. Shadows thickened between the trees. Finally, Jack stood and brushed rainwater from his sleeves. "We are going home." Ranger did not move. Jack took a step toward the trail. The dog stayed exactly where he was. Another step. Nothing. Then Ranger released a low bark and turned back toward the tree. Jack stopped. During all the years they had worked together, he had never seen the German shepherd ignore a command. Not once. A chill traveled down his spine despite the warm summer rain. Something inside that tree mattered enough for Ranger to break every rule he knew. And as thunder rolled softly across the distant mountains, Jack found himself staring at the ancient oak and wondering what secret could possibly be hidden beneath decades of bark and wood. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as though the storm had never happened. Sunlight spilled across the rolling Montana hills, painting the fields in shades of gold and green. Pine Hollow woke slowly. Farmers opened gates. Trucks rumbled along quiet roads. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from kitchens throughout town. Yet while everyone else returned to their routines, Jack Turner could not stop thinking about the old oak tree. More specifically, he could not stop thinking about Ranger. The German shepherd had finally followed him home well after midnight, but only after spending nearly 3 hours beside the strange growth on the tree. Even then, Ranger had looked back repeatedly as they left the forest, as if abandoning something important. The behavior bothered Jack more than he wanted to admit. Ranger was not impulsive. During years of training and service, the dog had developed a reputation for focus and discipline. He ignored distractions. He followed commands. Most importantly, he never fixated on meaningless things. If Ranger believed something mattered, Jack had learned to pay attention. Shortly after breakfast, he loaded a thermos of coffee into his truck and headed back toward the logging trail. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat before Jack even opened the door completely. That alone felt unusual. Normally, the dog loved morning drives, but today his excitement carried a different energy. His ears remained forward, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The 20-minute drive passed in silence. When they arrived, Ranger leaped from the truck before the engine stopped running. He immediately headed toward the forest path. Jack followed. The air smelled different after the storm. Cleaner, fresher. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, creating shifting patterns across the ground. Birds called from distant branches. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves overhead. Nothing about the woods seemed threatening. Nothing suggested mystery. Yet Ranger moved with complete certainty. Within minutes they reached the old oak. The dog trotted directly to the same spot as the night before, and stopped. Then he sat. Jack walked around the tree once again. In daylight, the bulge appeared even larger than he remembered, nearly the size of a small barrel. Thick bark covered every inch of it, blending naturally into the trunk. If Ranger had not drawn attention to it, most people would have walked past without a second glance. Jack examined the ground surrounding the roots. Damp soil, fallen leaves, pine needles. Nothing unusual. Ranger stood and approached the growth once more. This time he pressed his nose firmly against one section of bark. Then he looked back at Jack. The message was unmistakable. Here. Jack stepped closer. He ran his fingers across the exact spot where Ranger had been sniffing. The bark felt rough and weathered. Yet something caught his attention. A faint line, barely visible. It stretched vertically across part of the bulge before disappearing beneath layers of wood growth. Jack leaned closer. The line looked almost too straight, too deliberate. He frowned. Trees did not usually grow perfect lines. Ranger barked sharply. Jack took a photograph with his phone, then another. The more he studied the area, the stranger it seemed. The oak itself looked ancient, easily 80 or 90 years old, but the growth appeared younger somehow, as though the tree had expanded around something hidden beneath the surface. Ranger sat beside him patiently, watching, waiting, as if he already knew what Jack was beginning to suspect. A sudden voice broke the silence. That dog still bothering that tree? Jack turned. An elderly man stood on the trail carrying a fishing pole. His name was Walter Briggs, one of the oldest residents in Pine Hollow. Jack smiled. "Morning, Walter." The old man nodded toward Ranger. "Saw him here yesterday." He paused before glancing at the oak. "Funny thing about that tree." Jack's attention sharpened immediately. "What do you mean?" Walter shifted his tackle box from one hand to the other. His weathered face grew thoughtful. "When I was a boy, people used to tell stories about this place." Ranger rose to his feet. His ears lifted. Even the dog seemed to be listening. Walter looked toward the massive oak. "Something happened here a long time ago. Real long time ago." A breeze rustled through the branches overhead. Leaves shimmered in the sunlight. For a moment, the old man's gaze remained fixed on the strange growth protruding from the trunk. Then he quietly added, "And nobody ever figured out the whole story." Walter Briggs lowered himself onto a fallen log beneath the shade of the giant oak. The morning sun filtered through the branches above, casting moving patterns across the forest floor. Ranger sat beside Jack, completely still now, his amber eyes fixed on the elderly man. The German shepherd seemed unusually attentive, as though every word mattered. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth through the clearing. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against a distant trunk. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter removed his old cap and rubbed the back of his neck. "My grandfather used to tell me about this place," he said quietly, "back when Pine Hollow was barely more than a handful of cabins and a church." Jack folded his arms and listened. The old man pointed toward the massive oak. That tree was already standing here when he was a boy. Ranger slowly stood and walked around the trunk. His nose brushed against the strange growth before he returned to Jack's side. Walter noticed the movement. That dog reminds me of another one. Jack raised an eyebrow. Another dog? Walter nodded. A long time ago. His eyes remained fixed on the oak. There was a kid named Tommy Reynolds. Must have been 14 or 15. Good kid. Always wandering these woods with his dog. The old man's voice softened as he spoke. Nobody remembers much anymore. Most folks who knew him are gone now. The leaves overhead rustled softly. Ranger stared at Walter without blinking. One summer, Walter continued, Tommy stopped showing up around town. Jack frowned. What happened? The old man slowly shook his head. That is the thing. Nobody ever knew for sure. He picked up a small pine cone and rolled it between his fingers. People searched. Families searched. Neighbors searched. Even the sheriff searched. His gaze drifted toward the forest. Surrounding them. Weeks went by. Jack glanced toward the oak. Something about the story made the clearing feel different. Older somehow. He could almost imagine another time layered beneath the present. Another generation walking these same trails. Another dog running beneath these same branches. Walter exhaled slowly. The strange part was the dog. Ranger's ears immediately lifted. What happened to the dog? Jack asked. Walter smiled faintly. That old mutt kept returning here. He pointed directly at the giant oak. Every single day. A chill moved through Jack's chest. Ranger stood and walked toward the bulge once again. Walter watched him carefully. People thought the dog was grieving. Thought he was confused. The old man paused. But he would sit right here. Stare at this tree for hours. The forest suddenly felt very quiet. Even the birds seemed distant now. Jack looked toward the strange growth protruding from the trunk. The resemblance to Ranger's behavior was impossible to ignore. Walter noticed the same realization crossing Jack's face. You see it now. Jack nodded slowly. That is exactly what Ranger has been doing. The old man sighed. My grandfather always believed the dog was trying to tell people something. Ranger barked once. Sharp. Sudden. The sound echoed through the trees before fading away. Walter stared at the German shepherd for a long moment. Just like that. Jack felt goosebumps rise along his arms despite the warm sunlight. He turned back toward the tree. The strange line hidden within the bark seemed more noticeable now. More deliberate. As if the oak had been protecting a secret for decades. Walter eventually stood and brushed dirt from his jeans. Most folks forgot about the story years ago. He picked up his fishing pole. But every now and then, someone mentions the boy. The old man took a few steps down the trail before stopping. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. Funny thing is, nobody ever found what his dog kept trying to show them. Then he disappeared into the woods. Silence returned to the clearing. Ranger slowly approached the bulge and pressed his nose against the same spot once more. Jack walked over and placed his hand against the rough bark. The tree felt solid, ancient. Yet beneath his fingertips, he could not shake the feeling that something waited on the other side. Something hidden, something forgotten. And judging by the determination in Ranger's eyes, whatever had been buried inside this mystery all those years ago was finally running out of time to stay hidden. Jack remained beside the oak long after Walter Briggs disappeared down the trail. The forest had changed somehow. Not physically. The sunlight still filtered through the branches. The breeze still carried the scent of pine and damp bark. Yet the story lingered in the air like an unanswered question. Ranger sat at the base of the tree, staring at the strange growth protruding from the trunk. He had stopped barking now, but his focus had only intensified. It was the same look Jack had seen years earlier during search operations. The look that appeared whenever Ranger knew he was close to something important. Jack glanced at his watch. Nearly noon. He should have been heading home. Instead, he found himself taking more photographs. The unusual line in the bark. The shape of the growth. The surrounding roots. Every detail. Ranger watched quietly, as if approving the decision. By late afternoon, Jack found himself sitting inside the small office of the Pine Hollow Sheriff's Department. The building smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating framed photographs of past deputies and community events. Deputy Sarah Collins sat behind her desk reviewing the images Jack had taken. She was 36 years old, sharp-minded, practical, and not easily impressed by rumors. As she studied the photographs, Ranger rested beside Jack's chair. The German Shepherd remained unusually alert. Sarah zoomed in on one image showing the strange line hidden beneath the bark. "That is interesting," she admitted. Jack leaned forward. "You see it too?" Sarah nodded slowly. "It looks unnatural." She clicked through several more photographs. "But that does not mean there is anything dangerous inside." Jack understood. He was not claiming danger. Only mystery. Yet the mystery continued growing. Sarah eventually pushed the images aside and folded her arms. "Tell me about the dog." Jack smiled faintly. He had expected that question. Ranger has never behaved this way before. Sarah glanced toward the German Shepherd. "Never. Not once." The deputy studied Ranger carefully. The dog met her gaze without hesitation. Calm, confident, certain. Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Animals notice things people miss." She paused. "But I do not usually open investigations based on barking." Jack chuckled softly. "Neither do I." For a moment, silence settled over the office. Then something unexpected happened. Ranger stood. Without warning, he walked directly to the desk and placed his nose against the printed photograph of the oak tree. Sarah blinked. The dog held his position. Not aggressive, not excited, simply focused. Jack watched carefully. Ranger's nose remained pressed against the exact area where the strange growth appeared. Sarah exchanged a glance with Jack. "That is oddly specific." Ranger stepped back. Then he did it again. Same photograph, same location, same unwavering certainty. Sarah slowly reached for the image. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter. The deputy stared at the photograph for several seconds before speaking. "There is a forestry specialist in Billings." Jack looked up. "You want an expert opinion?" Sarah nodded. "If that growth is unusual, they will know." The following morning, they met with Daniel Mercer, a forestry consultant with nearly 30 years of experience studying old-growth trees throughout Montana. By midday, Daniel stood beside the giant oak with a measuring tape and inspection tools. Ranger remained nearby, watching every movement. The specialist circled the tree twice before stopping. He ran his fingers across the bark, examined the growth, studied the unusual line hidden within the wood. Then his expression changed. Jack noticed immediately. So did Sarah. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he stepped back and looked up at the massive trunk. This should not exist. The breeze seemed to stop. Even the forest felt still. Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed toward the growth. "Trees form scars, knots, burrow formations." He paused. "But this shape is different." Sarah crossed her arms. "Different how?" The specialist exhaled slowly. "It looks like the tree grew around something." Nobody spoke. Ranger walked forward and sat directly beside the bulge. Daniel watched him carefully. Then he looked back at the tree. Whatever is inside has probably been there for decades. A distant crow called from somewhere beyond the clearing. The sound echoed through the woods. Jack stared at the oak. Ranger stared at the oak. Even Sarah's skepticism seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. Because for the first time since this began, someone with expertise had confirmed what Ranger appeared to know all along. The ancient tree was not simply hiding a natural growth. It was protecting something buried deep inside its heart. The decision was made 2 days later. By then, the story had spread through Pine Hollow. Farmers discussed it over breakfast counters. Store owners mentioned it between customers. Even people who had never stepped foot near the old logging trail seemed to know about the giant oak and the German Shepherd who refused to leave it alone. Yet despite the growing curiosity, nobody expected what would happen next. The morning arrived cool and clear. Thin clouds drifted across a pale blue sky, while sunlight filtered through the towering pines surrounding the clearing. Ranger was already there when Jack arrived. The German Shepherd sat exactly where he always did, directly beside the strange growth protruding from the trunk. His posture remained calm, but his attention never wavered. It was as though he had been waiting for this day. Deputy Sarah Collins parked her vehicle nearby. Forestry specialist Daniel Mercer stepped out of a utility truck carrying inspection tools. A small group of local officials followed behind them. No crowd, no reporters, just a handful of people determined to finally learn the truth. The forest felt unusually quiet. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the moment. Daniel approached the oak first. He examined the growth one final time. Before turning toward Sarah, "If there is something inside, we should know within minutes." Sarah nodded. Jack remained beside Ranger. The dog stared at the tree without blinking. A portable cutting tool was brought forward. Nothing large enough to damage the tree unnecessarily. Daniel wanted precision. Care. The goal was to expose only a small section of the growth. The machine started with a low mechanical hum. Birds immediately scattered from nearby branches. Ranger stood. His ears lifted. His eyes locked onto the exact spot where the cut would begin. Jack placed a hand gently against the dog's shoulder. The first layer of bark came away slowly. Thin fragments drifted to the ground. Beneath them appeared dense wood. Decades of growth compressed together by time. Daniel continued carefully. Minutes passed. The opening widened. The scent of freshly exposed oak filled the clearing. Then the specialist suddenly stopped. Nobody spoke. Daniel crouched closer. Sarah stepped forward. Jack felt his pulse quicken. Ranger remained perfectly still. The forestry expert brushed away loose wood dust with his glove. Something dark appeared beneath the surface. Not wood. Not bark. Something else. Hold on, Daniel whispered. The clearing fell silent. He carefully cleared more material away. The dark shape became larger. More defined. Metallic. Sarah stared. That is not part of the tree. Daniel nodded slowly. For years he had studied forests throughout Montana. Yet even he looked stunned. The object appeared completely enclosed within the oak's growth. Hidden so deeply that nature itself seemed to have sealed it away. More wood was removed. Gradually, the outline emerged. A small metal container, roughly the size of a lunchbox. Rectangular. Rusted. Ancient. Nobody moved for several seconds. Jack could hear only the distant rustling of leaves and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Ranger took a single step forward. Then another. The German shepherd stopped directly beside the opening. His gaze never left the metal box. Sarah exhaled slowly. My God. Daniel carefully touched the surface. This has been here a very long time. The realization settled over the group like a wave. Decades. Possibly generations. All hidden inside the heart of the oak. Protected by layers of wood that had slowly grown around it year after year. Ranger sat down. For the first time since this began, his posture seemed different. Less tense. Almost relieved. Jack noticed immediately. The dog was not focused on the tree anymore. He was focused on the box. As if the object itself had always been the destination. Daniel worked carefully until the container could be removed without damage. The metal surface was weathered and covered in rust, but remarkably intact. He carried it into a patch of sunlight and placed it gently on a folding table. Everyone gathered around. Sarah knelt beside it. Jack stood behind her with Ranger at his side. Nobody spoke. The box felt strangely important. Not because of its size. Not because of its appearance. But because of how long it had waited. Daniel finally located the latch. His hands paused for a moment. Then he slowly opened it. The hinges released with a faint metallic creak. Sunlight spilled across the contents inside. Sarah's eyes widened. Jack froze. Ranger stared silently. Because resting within the box, untouched by time, was a carefully folded bundle of old letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, a small black and white photograph, and a military dog tag that seemed to have been waiting decades for someone to finally bring it back into the light. For several moments, nobody touched anything inside the box. The forest seemed to hold its breath alongside them. Sunlight filtered through the branches of the ancient oak, illuminating the contents with a soft golden glow. The faded blue ribbon remained tied neatly around the stack of letters. The black and white photograph rested beside them, and the military dog tag lay near the edge of the container, its worn metal surface reflecting flashes of light. Ranger sat perfectly still. The German shepherd's gaze never left the box. His ears remained forward, alert but calm. Whatever urgency had driven him to the tree appeared to be fading. Jack noticed it immediately. The dog who had spent days barking at the oak now seemed content simply watching. Deputy Sarah. Collins carefully lifted the photograph first. Time had yellowed the edges, but the image remained surprisingly clear. A teenage boy stood smiling beside a dog. The two looked inseparable. The boy could not have been older than 15. His arm rested around the dog's neck. Both stared proudly into the camera. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Sarah slowly turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink were 4 words. Tommy and Rusty. Summer 1958. Jack felt a chill travel through him. Walter Briggs had mentioned Tommy Reynolds, the boy who disappeared decades earlier. Now they were looking at his face. Daniel Mercer removed his cap and lowered his eyes respectfully. Sarah carefully placed the photograph back on the table before reaching for the letters. The paper looked fragile but remarkably preserved. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first page. The handwriting belonged to a teenager. Slightly uneven. Honest. Human. Sarah began reading aloud. The words carried softly through the clearing. Tommy wrote about growing up in Pine Hollow. He wrote about fishing in the creek, about helping his father repair fences, about climbing the old oak tree with Rusty beside him. As Sarah continued reading, the years seemed to disappear. The boy no longer felt like a mystery from history. He felt real, present, like someone sitting beside them beneath the branches. Then the letters changed. The later pages became more personal. Tommy described a disagreement with his family, dreams of leaving town, regrets he never knew how to express, apologies he never found the courage to say aloud. The final letter was addressed not to strangers, but to his parents. Sarah's voice softened as she read the closing lines. The boy explained that he had hidden the box himself. He wanted to leave behind the truth about how much he loved his family, even when he struggled to show it. He wrote that if anyone ever found the letters, he hoped they would be delivered home. Silence followed. Even the breeze seemed quieter now. Jack looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd remained seated beside the table. Calm, patient, almost peaceful. Sarah carefully wiped her eyes before reaching for the dog tag. The worn metal carried a name engraved across its surface. Not Tommy Reynolds. Another name entirely. Jack leaned closer. The tag belonged to a young Marine from the same era. Tucked beneath it was a final folded note explaining everything. Years before his disappearance, Tommy had discovered the lost dog tag near the creek after a summer flood. Unable to identify its owner, he had placed it inside the box with the intention of someday returning it. He never got the chance. The clearing remained silent as the meaning settled over everyone present. For decades, the letters had waited. The photograph had waited. The dog tag had waited, hidden inside the oak while seasons came and went, while families grew older, while memories faded. Yet somehow, they had survived. Ranger slowly stood and walked toward the base of the tree. He sat beneath the massive trunk and looked up into the branches overhead. Jack followed him with his eyes. Something about the moment felt impossible to explain. No training could account for it. No simple answer seemed large enough. A dog born decades after Tommy Reynolds had somehow led them to a promise left unfinished for nearly 70 years. Sarah carefully gathered the letters. "We need to find the family," she whispered. Jack nodded. The sun drifted lower across the Montana sky. Golden light settled over the clearing. Beneath the ancient oak, Ranger finally lowered his head onto his paws. For the first time since this journey began, the German shepherd closed his eyes and rested, as though the signal he had been carrying for all those days had finally reached the people who were meant to hear it. The search began the very next morning. Pine Hollow was a small town, but nearly 70 years had passed since Tommy Reynolds had written those letters. People moved away. Families changed names. Old houses disappeared. Memories faded. Yet some stories refused to vanish completely. Deputy Sarah Collins spent hours combing through historical records inside the county archives. Dusty ledgers lined the shelves. Newspaper clippings filled worn folders. Birth certificates, marriage records, property maps, and census. Reports stretched back decades. The building smelled of paper, wood polish, and time itself. Outside, winter clouds drifted slowly across the Montana sky. Inside, Sarah followed one clue after another. By afternoon, she found something. Tommy Reynolds had a younger sister, Emily Reynolds Harper. Unlike most of the family, she had never left Montana. According to public records, she still lived less than 60 miles away in a small town near Livingston. When Sarah shared the news, Jack felt a wave of quiet relief. After all these years, someone remained. Someone who might still remember. 2 days later, Jack, Sarah, and Ranger drove south through rolling valleys covered in fresh snow. The mountains rose in the distance like silent guardians watching over the land. Ranger sat calmly in the back seat. Since the discovery beneath the oak tree, the German shepherd seemed different. Lighter somehow. More at peace. The urgency that had consumed him for days had disappeared. Yet his eyes remained attentive whenever the old photograph or letters appeared, as if he understood their importance. By mid-morning, they arrived at a modest farmhouse surrounded by bare cottonwood trees. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney into the cold air. The house stood quietly against the winter landscape. Sarah stepped onto the porch and knocked gently. A few moments later, the door opened. An elderly woman appeared. Her silver hair was neatly combed. Her eyes carried the softness of someone who had lived a long life, filled with both joy and sorrow. Sarah introduced herself and explained why they had come. At first, the woman looked confused. Then Sarah carefully unfolded the black and white photograph. Everything changed. The elderly woman's hand immediately rose to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes before a single word was spoken. "Tommy," she whispered. The name seemed to carry an entire lifetime inside it. Jack watched quietly. Ranger remained beside him, calm and respectful. Emily Harper invited them inside. The farmhouse was warm and filled with family photographs. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. For the next hour, Emily shared stories about her brother, stories that she had not spoken aloud in years. She described fishing trips beside the creek, summer afternoons climbing trees, the loyal dog named Rusty who followed Tommy everywhere. Sometimes she laughed while remembering. Sometimes her voice trembled. Through it all, Ranger lay quietly near the fireplace, listening. Finally, Sarah placed the letters on the kitchen table. Emily stared at them for several seconds. Her hands shook slightly as she untied the faded blue ribbon. The room fell silent. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently across the fields. Inside, only the ticking clock could be heard. Emily unfolded the first page and began reading. Tears rolled down her cheeks almost immediately. She continued reading through every letter, every memory, every apology, every expression of love that had remained hidden for nearly 7 decades. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed her. Some moments deserve silence. When she reached the final page, she lowered the letter slowly and closed her eyes. The sunlight illuminated the paper resting in her hands. For a long time, she simply sat there. Then she smiled. It was a small smile. Gentle, peaceful. The kind of smile that appears when a wound finally stops hurting after years of carrying it. "He came home," she whispered. Jack felt his throat tighten. Sarah looked away for a moment. Even Ranger lifted his head from the rug and watched quietly. Emily reached across the table and touched the photograph. "All these years," she said softly, "we never knew what he wanted to say." The room remained still, warm, full of something deeper than happiness. It felt like completion, like a promise finally fulfilled. As afternoon sunlight filled the farmhouse, Jack glanced toward Ranger. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the golden light from the window. And for the briefest moment, it seemed as though the old dog beneath the oak tree from long ago and the German shepherd resting beside the fireplace now were connected by something invisible. Not by time, not by reason, but by loyalty. The kind that waits patiently until every lost message finally finds its way home. News of the discovery spread far beyond Pine Hollow during the weeks that followed. What began as a curious story about a German shepherd barking at an old oak tree gradually became something much larger. Local newspapers wrote about it. Regional television stations visited the town. People from neighboring counties stopped by simply to see the tree for themselves. Yet the attention never seemed to affect Ranger. While others spoke about mysteries and miracles, the German shepherd returned to his normal routines. He accompanied Jack on morning walks. He rested on the porch during quiet evenings. He chased drifting leaves across snowy fields whenever the wind picked up. Life moved forward, but something had changed inside the people around him. One Saturday afternoon, the Pine Hollow Historical Society organized a small gathering beneath the old oak. Nothing elaborate, just neighbors, families, and longtime residents coming together to honor a story that had finally reached its ending. The winter sky stretched bright and clear overhead. Snow remained scattered across the forest floor, sparkling beneath the sunlight. Folding chairs were arranged around the clearing. A simple wooden table displayed copies of the photograph, the recovered letters, and information about Tommy Reynolds and his family. Ranger walked beside Jack through the crowd. Children immediately recognized him. Some waved. Others smiled shyly. The German shepherd greeted them gently before settling near the base of the oak, the same place where he had spent so many days refusing to leave. Jack noticed several older residents staring at the tree with thoughtful expressions. For many of them, The story had become part of local folklore long ago, something whispered about, but never fully understood. Now, for the first time, there were answers. Emily Harper arrived shortly before noon. The elderly woman moved slowly but confidently, supported by a cane and accompanied by several family members. When she stepped into the clearing, conversations softened. People greeted her warmly. Some embraced her. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. She spent several minutes standing beneath the enormous oak, gazing up through the branches. The tree that had protected her brother's final message for nearly 70 years now seemed less like a mystery and more like a guardian. Eventually, Emily addressed the gathering. Her voice was gentle but steady. She spoke about Tommy, about family, about forgiveness. She shared stories that made people laugh, stories that brought tears. Most of all, she spoke about the letters. The greatest gift was not finding answers, she said softly. The greatest gift was hearing his voice again. Silence followed her words. Not an uncomfortable silence. A meaningful one. The kind that settles over people when something true has been spoken. Ranger remained beneath the oak, watching quietly. A light breeze moved through the branches overhead. Sunlight flickered across the bark. For a moment, Jack found himself remembering that first rainy night. The barking, the confusion, the strange certainty in Ranger's eyes. None of it made sense then. Yet somehow every step had led here. Later that afternoon, the Pine Hollow Historical Society unveiled a small bronze plaque near the base of the tree. The inscription did not mention mysteries or headlines. Instead, it honored remembrance, family, and the enduring power of loyalty. Visitors gathered around it while children explored nearby trails and neighbors exchanged stories. The atmosphere felt more like a reunion than a ceremony. Emily eventually approached Ranger. The German shepherd stood politely as she knelt beside him. Her weathered hand rested gently against his neck. Tears shimmered in her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of grief. "Thank you," she whispered. Ranger responded with a soft wag of his tail. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just a simple gesture. Yet many people watching found themselves wiping away tears. Because in that quiet exchange, they witnessed something larger than explanation. A promise fulfilled. A family healed. A message delivered across generations. As the winter sun began descending toward the mountains, long shadows stretched across the clearing. The crowd slowly dispersed. Vehicles disappeared down the logging road. Voices faded. The forest grew quiet once again. Only Jack and Ranger remained beneath the oak for a little while longer. The German shepherd sat where he always had, looking up at the branches swaying gently against the afternoon sky. The urgency was gone now. The waiting was over. And for the first time since this journey began, the old tree no longer seemed to be holding a secret. It seemed to be holding peace. Spring arrived quietly in Pine Hollow. Snow retreated from the valleys. Wildflowers returned to the hillsides. Streams swollen by melting ice carried clear mountain water through the forests once again. Life continued much as it always had. Ranchers repaired fences. Children rode bicycles along quiet roads. The town settled back into its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, something felt different. The story hidden inside the old oak had left its mark on everyone who knew it, especially on Jack Turner. One warm afternoon several months later, he parked his truck beside the logging trail and stepped into the forest with Ranger at his side. Sunlight filtered through fresh green leaves overhead. The air smelled of pine needles, damp soil, and new growth. Birds filled the woods with song. The trail felt lighter now, no longer haunted by unanswered questions, no longer carrying the weight of decades of uncertainty. Ranger moved comfortably through the trees, occasionally stopping to investigate an interesting scent before trotting ahead again. His pace was relaxed. Content. The urgency that had once driven him toward the oak was gone completely. When they finally reached the clearing, Jack paused. The ancient tree stood exactly where it always had. Strong, silent, timeless. The bronze plaque rested nearby, partially illuminated by shafts of afternoon sunlight. Wildflowers had begun blooming around its base. The strange growth that once concealed the metal box remained visible, though carefully protected after the discovery. Visitors still came occasionally. Families left flowers. Some left handwritten notes. Others simply stood beneath the branches and reflected for a while before continuing on their way. Ranger approached the tree slowly. Jack watched him carefully. For a moment, he wondered whether the German shepherd would return to the exact spot where everything had begun. Instead, Ranger surprised him. The dog circled the oak once, sniffed the grass near the roots, then stretched out comfortably beneath the shade and rested his head on his paws. Nothing more. No barking. No searching. No waiting. Jack smiled. Somehow, that felt important. He sat nearby and listened to the breeze moving through the leaves. The forest seemed peaceful in a way that words could not fully describe. As though a chapter had closed. As though something unfinished had finally found its ending. Hours passed quietly. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the sky. Golden light painted the clearing in warm colors. Ranger slept beside the tree. Occasionally his ears twitched at distant sounds. Otherwise he remained perfectly still. Jack thought about Tommy Reynolds. About Rusty. About the letters hidden for nearly 70 years. About Emily Harper finally hearing her brother's voice again. Most of all, he thought about loyalty. Not the kind celebrated in speeches or carved into monuments. The quieter kind. The kind that waits. The kind that remembers. The kind that refuses to let something important be forgotten. A soft wind moved through the branches overhead. Leaves rustled gently against one another. For a brief moment, Jack closed his eyes and simply listened. When he opened them again, Ranger was awake. The German shepherd stood, stretched, and walked toward him. Then the dog did something unusual. He glanced once toward the oak. Just once. Not with urgency. Not with concern. More like acknowledgement. As though saying goodbye to an old responsibility. Then he returned to Jack's side. Together, they started walking back toward the trail. Neither looked back immediately. There was no need. Some stories demand dramatic endings. This one did not. The truth had been found. The letters had reached home. The family had found peace. The promise had been fulfilled. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Jack finally turned around. The ancient oak stood alone beneath the evening sky, its branches swaying softly in the spring breeze. Sunlight shimmered through the leaves like scattered gold. For an instant, the tree seemed less like a landmark and more like a witness. A witness to generations of love, loss, hope, and remembrance. Jack placed a hand gently on Ranger's shoulder. The German shepherd leaned against him for a moment before continuing down the trail. Behind them, the forest grew quiet once more. Ahead of them, the path disappeared into warm evening light. And somewhere between the old oak and the fading horizon, a message that had waited nearly a lifetime was finally at peace.